Hey everyone. So this is a follow-up to the previous video on free will or the lack thereof. And yet this video can stand on its own as well. I see a lot of confusion both in my own spiritual community and other spiritual communities that really hinges on the fact that usually in discourse, we don't really clarify what the pronoun I or me or you refers to. And in the realm of spirituality, especially non-dual spirituality, it's pretty important to get clear on that, and that a statement which is perfectly valid when the pronoun refers to one aspect of embodied consciousness is totally invalid when the statement refers to some other aspect of embodied consciousness. So in this regard, it will be useful if you've read or listened to the section in Tantra Illuminated on the five-layered self, the so-called five-layered self, or the five aspects of embodied consciousness, we could also call it. So just to give some examples, right? If I were to say to someone, oh, you can totally jump over that, then I'm actually referring to their body, right? That's the body layer of embodied consciousness, right? The you in question there is actually the body, right? And we use this, we have this usage all the time. Like if, even a little kid, if their, sister hits them, then they'll say, you hit me, right? The body, the me refers to the body, right? And all of these usages are perfectly legitimate. The problem in spiritual contexts just comes when we don't have clear in our minds what we're actually talking about. So by the same token, if I say, oh, I can't solve this trigonometry problem, the I there is referring to the mind, or what we call the mind for the sake of convenience, right? And likewise, if I say, I'm hungry, then the I there refers to prana, life force energy, traditionally speaking, right? Using this model that was articulated over 1,000 years ago in the tantric tradition, in which being hungry or thirsty is thought to be a function of prana shakti, life force energy. And if your prana is disordered or deranged in some way, then you will be hungry when your body doesn't really need food, or you will not be hungry when your body actually does need food. So an otherwise adequately functioning human body can have a problem with its prana, right? So I don't need to get into that, but I'm just giving traditional examples. I'm hungry is a traditional example for the pronoun I referring to the prana shakti layer, the life force energy. And if I say, I am pure, transcendent, spacious nothingness, or I am the spacious open ground of being, then of course the I is referring to the level we call shunya, the void, right? It's not really a level, right? This is just a way of talking. The aspect of embodied consciousness that is its capacity to experience itself as this pure, limitless, spacious openness, this transcendent ground of being, sometimes called the void. And then, of course, we have consciousness, sort of capital C consciousness or capital A awareness. These terms are interchangeable. Which is that which manifests as all the other layers of embodiment or embodied consciousness, right? So non-dual awareness is precisely that which manifests as void and prana and mind and body and everything else. Okay, so we can't really define it more specifically than that, than to say it's that which equally manifests as the transcendent void and as the flesh and blood and everything else that is experienceable, is a mode of being, or a phase, if you will, of this non-dual consciousness. Using the word phase there in much the same sense that we refer to phase transitions of water. Water can appear as ice or liquid or vapor. Those are different phases of the same thing, right? Okay, so this is just, almost a grade school version of this teaching, but it's pretty important to comprehend in this very basic way before we try to nuance it. So when I say you have no control over anything of significance, you have no control over any outcome, you cannot determine any outcome. I'm, of course, speaking from the perspective of the body-mind, or speaking to the body-mind, rather. And of course, sometimes the pronoun you or I can encompass more than one layer of the self at the same time. So you have no control over anything of significance is speaking to the whole body-mind complex. And that the idea here is, if you relinquish the notion that you can determine outcomes, then you experience peacefulness, peace of mind, right? Now, of course, we know that you, being the body-mind, can influence outcomes, and probably you should try to influence outcomes. It's a very normal human thing to do. But when you attempt to influence outcomes without any attachment to the notion that you could possibly determine the outcome, make it go one way or the other, if you truly deeply accept that all you can do is exert some fairly small quantity of influence over any significant event, then you're able to simply play your part and be content with that. And this, of course, is the famous teaching of the Bhagavad Gita. Okay, so when I say there's no free will, who am I speaking to there? Well, I'll explain. I'm speaking to the body-mind, right? And what does it mean? We already went over in the previous video, right? What it means to say that the body-mind doesn't really have free will. It simply means that the body-mind will always do the same thing in every situation, which is choose what seems like the best option available to it, given the knowledge, information, and resources that it has at that moment, right? So there are always causes and conditions that constrain our choice until it narrows down to one. That's how we're able to make a choice, right? If the causes and conditions do not narrow the choice down to one, then we remain ambivalent. Okay, and so choice is real, of course, even though there's no such thing as free will, as already defined in the previous video, that it's not true that you chose A, but you could have chosen B. And yet choice is real. How does that make sense? Well, as one of my brilliant students said, this could be explained through the analogy of solving an equation. If you know how to solve an equation, if you're equipped with the skills to do that, right, then you can solve an algebraic equation, and the answer to the problem, right, is already predetermined in the sense that there is only one correct answer. Of course, there can be equations that have more than one correct answer too, but whether there's one correct answer or several, those answers already exist, waiting for you to discover them, as it were. But that doesn't exempt you from the process of having to solve the equation if you want to know what the answer is. So you solve the equation and you discover what the answer is. And this is analogous to the process of having to make a choice. You have to go through the process of making a choice, even though, of course, you're only going to end up doing exactly what you always do, which is choosing what looks like the best option available to you amongst the options that you can see, right? Okay, so then we have to consider the possibility, and in this case, the facticity, I would say, that what's true for one level or layer or aspect of our being is not necessarily true at another level, and vice versa. Okay, so the body mind doesn't have free will, meaning it can't choose outside of the matrix of causes and conditions within which it is embedded. But that which you fundamentally are, which we call consciousness or awareness or God, you know, that is nothing but free will. Meaning to say, and this, of course, is just going to sound like a religious doctrine until you experience it for yourself. But this non-dual awareness, which manifests as all the layers of selfhood and everything else, is constantly choosing, as it were, to manifest in exactly the way that it does. Now, here language becomes problematic because it's not like it's choosing amongst options, because divine consciousness, that which you are, is not a mind. It's not seeing several options in front of itself and choosing one of them. That's indeed what the mind does. But divine consciousness is freely willing itself to become that which is in every given moment. Now, okay, language is so problematic here because any way you try to language it, it's gonna introduce an artificial dualism, which is just a function of language, not a function of reality. But the teaching here is that consciousness spontaneously becomes the substance of every experience whatsoever, and it does so freely and independently, right? That's the first sutra of the recognition sutras, Chitti Swatantra Vishwasiddhi Hetuhu, that consciousness or non-dual awareness freely and independently, under no outside influence, is the cause of the performance of everything, right? Or the cause of the accomplishment of everything, or the cause of the fulfillment of everything, different ways to translate that sutra, right? So in other words, awareness, that which you fundamentally are, divine consciousness, whatever you want to call it, freely becomes the substance of every experience whatsoever, freely chooses that in the sense that is, it gives itself to that wholly and completely, right? And then to whatever manifests in the next moment and the next moment and the next moment, right? This is the way we conceptualize it, as a succession of moments, right? But it's really just a spontaneous self-transformation of the one within the context of the eternal now. So from the absolute perspective, there's not actually such a thing as time, but it seems as if there is, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, so I do like to present myself with challenges of things that are very difficult to language, but that's fun. But it also means that I'm not going to get it perfectly right. You know, when we're talking about things that are very difficult to language, there's no way to get it perfectly right. And perhaps later I'll think of a better way to say it, but this is okay for now. So back to this, you know, question of so-called free will, and let's remember, by the way, that a lot of the intellectual problem here lies in the phrase itself. The phrase free will itself is the problem, really. It's not really the phrase that we should be debating, but it is a phrase that people use, you know. but the phrase itself is misleading from the get-go, you know. But having said that, you know, I said in the prior video, and this confused some people, you couldn't have done otherwise vis-a-vis any past decision. And you can't do otherwise in the present moment than as you are doing, meaning to say, let's just give some examples. You have the reaction that you're having, and in the next moment, another reaction might be available to you, but you can't help whether it's available to you. Like, let's say somebody does something and initially you're angry. But then you remember a teaching somebody gave you. Oh, you can't choose how you react, but you can choose how you respond. And that teaching seems compelling and true and real to you in that moment. So therefore, you take a breath and you consider the possibility of responding in a different way than angrily. And the ability to act on that possibility is available to you, or it's not. But you can't really help any of that in the given moment, right? You can't help whether that teaching seems like something that's actionable, right, or true. And if it is, then you act on that basis. And then you might tell yourself the story. You see, I exercised my free will. I wanted to be angry and just yell at that person, but I took a breath and I responded in a more level-headed way. Well, that's simply evidence of the fact that the mind is in a process of reconditioning itself, right? So when you get a hold of philosophy or spiritual teachings or even a self-help book and it seems compelling to you, which is not something you can choose, right? Then the mind uses that tool to recondition itself. It sees a possible advantage to doing so, and it does so to whatever degree it's capable, right? So a mind that's in the process of reconditioning itself, or has reconditioned itself, now has options that were not available before, right? And so it enables you to tell this story, right? That, oh, look, I chose differently. Well, but the process actually unfolded totally spontaneously, right? The person did the thing and you couldn't help getting angry, right? But then this other possibility occurred to you. You couldn't help whether or not it occurred to you. It just did. And that's wonderful. That's worthy of celebration, right? And then the ability to act on the other possibility is either there or it's not. And here's the point where a lot of people beat themselves up. They say, oh, I sensed the possibility to react or respond in a more healthy way or a more compassionate way, but I couldn't do it. And then they just beat themselves mercilessly over this. I mean, nobody can beat themselves up better than a so-called spiritual person, right? When they think they know better, but they weren't able to act on that knowledge. But this is nonsense. This is insanity, right? And the person in question is not yet really spiritual, right? Which is perfectly fine. Because you see, when this other possibility occurs to you, oh, I can see the benefit of responding in this way, but you're not actually able to act on it. That's nobody's fault. It's not your fault. It's not anyone's fault. The idea of fault itself is pure nonsense, by the way. But anyway, you see, so there's no point in beating yourself up, because if you could have acted on this deeper wisdom that you've acquired, then you would. Of course you would. Why wouldn't you? There's every reason to, and it's beneficial to do so for all parties involved. So if you couldn't do it, why would you beat yourself up over that? Just trust that with time, these things will become more and more actionable, right? So you see the issue. If you tell yourself the story, oh, I was able to make a different choice, then you're also going to beat yourself up when it seems like you weren't able to make that choice, or when in fact you weren't, right? But you imagine you could have done, right? So this ability to imagine counterfactuals it's an ultimate curse and an ultimate blessing both, because when we imagine counterfactuals, we can work for those possibilities that we see to be beneficial, right? Whatever it might be. There's a ever worsening climate crisis. We can imagine the possibility that of mitigating that climate crisis, and then we can act on that basis. Well, so far the majority of us can't, but it's at any rate, you see my point. Ability to imagine a counterfactual can be highly beneficial, or it can also be a source of really insidious self-hatred, right? So again, you only have the resources that you have at that given moment, because it's not just about the information that you have, right? It's also about the resources that you have. So you can see what is a better choice, or a probably more beneficial choice, because actually you can never be sure, but you can see what's probably a more beneficial choice, but you don't have sufficient inspiration or self-confidence or whatever it takes to act on that yet, right? In that particular moment, your samskaras, your unresolved past experiences, or your trauma or whatever is too strong for you to act on that wisdom that you're in the process of acquiring in that particular moment. But at another moment, you are able to act on it. Why would you blame anyone for either situation? You don't deserve credit or blame. This is simply what was possible in that moment, and each moment is part of the unfolding of an infinitely complex pattern, the pattern of being. Okay, so that which you fundamentally are expresses itself as this very pattern. Now we call it an unfolding pattern when we're speaking in terms of time, right? And there is time from one perspective. It's just not an ultimately true perspective, right? Unless you understand that all time already exists, right? And you're only able to see part of the terrain of space-time at any given moment, but all space-time already exists, right? If you understand that, then you can perfectly well say that time exists. It exists as a whole. But anyway, that's a whole, I can't get into that right now. So the pattern is unfolding in exactly the ways that it must do. It's unfurling itself, and it will continue to do so for trillions of years. And then the question arises, can we align the body-mind with fundamental consciousness, or divine consciousness, or whatever we're calling that, in such a way that the body-mind becomes more of a channel, as it were, for that, rather than just a regurgitator of its conditioning? And the answer to that, of course, is yes, that most body-minds simply are regurgitating their conditioning, right? It's an input-output machine. But that there's this possibility of alignment with the principle that makes all existence possible in the first place, whatever we call that, God if you want, in a non-dual sense. But people then get into magical thinking about that. If I could align, and which I are we talking about, could align the body-mind with this fundamental consciousness, then it will just be rainbows and happy and light, and pure love will flow through me, and everyone will recognize it, and I'll be a beacon of light for all humanity, and or whatever their version of the magical thinking is, okay? So the impulse to align the body-mind with this deeper principle either arises or it doesn't, right? And if it arises, it's either compelling enough to be actionable or it's not. All of this is unchosen, of course, right? If it's compelling enough to be actionable, there are the tools and resources available to act on this impulse, or there aren't, also unchosen, right? So you don't get credit or blame for any of this. I mean, of course, the you that you imagine could receive the credit or blame is itself a mental construct, right? It's a self-representation on the part of the mind. It's the mind imagining itself to be the source of inspiration and action when in fact it's not. Okay, so let's say the inspiration is there and it's compelling and the tools are there, and so therefore this alignment takes place. Can there be sort of something like perfect alignment of the body mind with the deeper principle of existence? I don't know, maybe, but I don't think that's the right question to be asking. A more interesting question, an important one, is what does it look like when it happens, when there is this alignment? Well, see, the thing is, it's not as magical as you might imagine. I mean, it is, but it's also not, right? Because for the one who's experiencing it, it is magical in the sense that there's a kind of blissful flow. There's just this spontaneous blissful flow that feels perfectly effortless. And let's say you're just teaching a yoga class in this state of alignment, then the whole class just feels like spontaneous blissful flow, and there's no sense of effort. It's not me doing it. Something bigger came through. Of course, it is you doing it. But that sentence takes the me to be the body mind. So from the perspective of the body mind, it's not me doing it. Okay, fine. Now, does this mean, though, that the class is going to be the best yoga class ever taught and every student in it is going to go, oh my God, that was amazing? No, not necessarily. That's where the magical thinking is problematic, you see, because the people in the yoga class are going to be as open as they are, as receptive as they are, as ready for something spiritual to get transmitted as they are. And if they're quite closed and they only want a physical workout, and there you are being inspirational and it's all in alignment and it's all perfectly true, then it doesn't necessarily land for those people. Now, I'm making it kind of overly simplistic here, because would this inspirational language spontaneously arise for one who's in alignment if nobody in the room is open to it? Actually, no, it's almost certainly will not arise. But let's say one person in the room is open to it, and that is intuitively sensed in this state of alignment that we're talking about, where there's alignment of body mind with the deeper principle as opposed to kind of some sort of misalignment. Then, it could be that it lands perfectly for one person in the class, and for other people in the class, it's like, why do you have to get spiritual? I just want to sweat or whatever, right? So if you are seeing yourself as the doer, then you're going to be like, oh, and you're going to notice, as you're evolutionarily programmed, I'm afraid, to notice the negative feedback more than the positive feedback. And you're going to get all hung up on that instead of realizing, oh, that was actually wonderful. And it must have been for that one person who did get it, for whom it landed, Okay. My point is that even when this alignment is present, the inspiration that arises from this deepest principle of being, our divine self, if you want to call it that, is still channeled through a body mind that is constrained by causes and conditions. And that's precisely why it can't just do something magical all the time. Again, it can feel magical for you because there's this sense of flow and effortlessness, and you can just relax into it and you feel the bliss of that alignment. And that's all real and true. That's not made up, it's a real thing. But the results are going to be whatever they're going to be. And you know, that which is flowing always through this contracted form, right? This body mind constrained by various causes and conditions. And that's why no matter how aligned somebody is, they're not going to give, you know, the perfect spiritual talk that could liberate all beings if they just heard it. That's never going to happen, you know, or the perfect yoga class that will liberate all beings through yoga if they just would take it, you know, or whatever. Do you see what I mean? Okay. Okay. So, you know, I rattled off this video again with no notes or preparation, other than a few minutes silent contemplation. And that's because what I'm talking about is what I can see to be true. Now, here's another problem. It's not I like, oh, you know, Harish is so great. Look what he can see. No, it's just a fact. The fact of vantage point is that some things are visible from a certain vantage point, and other things are not. There's plenty I can't see with clarity, for sure, as my critics are quick to point out, and it's great that they do. But not that all the critics are correct, of course. But you see, my point is that this is the reason that you have a teacher, right? It doesn't matter if it's me or someone else. You have a teacher precisely because you're convinced that they can see more than you do. But the important thing is that it's not about knowing more things. It's not about knowing more concepts. When we're talking about spirituality, right? If you're looking for a teacher of engineering or mathematics, they better know more concepts than you, right? But the teacher of spirituality, it's not that they know more concepts. I mean, they might, but that's not what's relevant. It's that more of the pattern is in view for them. And why is more of the pattern in view for them? Just by virtue of the fact that they've woken up out of separate self. Okay, so if you're still dwelling within the you know, psychosomatic prison that we call separate self, there's a lot that's not visible, which would otherwise be plainly visible, you know. And this is where sort of Plato's cave metaphor comes in. You know, the world is there right outside the cave, but they don't see it. They just see the shadows on the wall, right? And so it's not because they're inherently inferior. It's because they haven't yet learned where to look, right? So the awake person is not superior in any way. They're just they've become free of certain constraints. In Plato's cave, the people are chained up, right, until they're not, until they figure out how to escape or whatever. And those chains are, in this tradition anyway, and I'm appropriating, by the way, I'm appropriating a Western philosophical metaphor into an Eastern spiritual framework. Those chains are nothing but, from this point of view, the sense of separate self and the construct of separate self that inhibits a lot of clear seeing, right? So waking up out of that, and there are other versions or other aspects to awakening. It confers a broader scope, right, and a clearer, higher definition, as it were, of seeing. So the more awakening happens, the more aspects of awakening come online, the more that clarity is there. And I don't imagine that it could ever become sort of infinite, right? That the clarity of view could be all encompassing, but it certainly seems that it can keep growing and becoming more and more clear indefinitely. And more and more of the pattern can come into view. Not, I would imagine, all the pattern is just far too complex, you know. Okay, so when trying to explain any of this stuff, one has to, in real time, choose kind of which caveats to mention and which not. If every possible caveat was mentioned in the course of such an explanation, then the video would be very long, potentially endless. I don't know. But so just understand, there are caveats to every point that was made, or not caveats exactly. Sometimes they are, but they're often just nuances. There are nuances worthy of exploring to virtually every point that was made in the video. And the fact that I didn't explore them, doesn't mean that they aren't there. Yeah. Okay. So that was fun. I hope it was fun for you. And I hope this stuff is starting to make sense. And, it's never going to fully make sense until you see it for yourself. But the point is, it's not that you're getting clear on a doctrine per se. You're just getting clear on what is apparent from this vantage point of awakeness. Now, somebody else who's awake might describe things differently, and that's a function of how the impulse to try to describe things is channeling through the constraints of their body mind, assuming that they're actually awake. Of course, there's plenty of people that just think they are. And how to tell the difference? Well, you just got to go on your intuition. There is no foolproof way until you're abiding in awakeness yourself, and then it's very clear. Okay, maybe there'll be a sequel to this video, but this is it for now. And enjoy your contemplative process, please. I mean, you might as well enjoy it as best you can, right?